uh, you know, discussions and research that is begging to be done. So these levels of adoption also of organic agroecology differ. And I think in this, the transitions framework is very helpful because it does indicate that a transition from an unsustainable thing to a sustainable system actually requires time and investment. And often government schemes give neither. So I've done it in one farm, so therefore it should be scaled up at the landscape level to the whole state. That's the rough kind of logic. But it requires farmers to learn over a period of 2 3 years, investment in agricultural extension systems that farmers can learn from farmers to farmers and so on. So this is the last paper. So essentially, what do these papers tell us? And I got one or two slides on this. So first thing is agroecology is not just about farming. It's not about the techniques of farming. Important as they are, it is also about other questions. It's a framework for rethinking agriculture. And that's coming through in all these papers. These transitions are not only technological, technical, or ecological, but they also involve political relations at at different levels, and also social relations at the village level, as we saw in Sabarmati's article. There are, of course, cross-cutting themes on justice and equity, the role of intermediaries, the importance of plurality of knowledge, and so on. As we mentioned earlier, there's not been enough work in the volume on state policy and state capacity. And how do you go beyond rhetoric of making India agroecologically, natural farming across the country? We now have a national mission on natural farming. So some of the detailed research actually gives us some insights on how the state needs to play a different role as an enabler and facilitator in transitions. And can the state actually support innovation intermediaries? And innovation intermediaries mean institutions like higher education institutions, academia, etc., to be involved in this process. So, in conclusion, this is more an invitation. So, what I hope to have demonstrated is that this domain, and we've looked only at agriculture, has significant scope, and some of the researchers have demonstrated that. And there's scope for much further research, and there are lots of opportunities for publication if we were to take this theme a bit more seriously. In terms of what's happening on sustainability transitions, I think the critical element that comes out from India is that all these papers that you talk about, there is not one single way of doing things. It's so complex because of the diversity of farmers, and states. Each state has a different kind of policy and so on. How do you embed diversity in our research design? And of course, this issue of how do you engage with issues of sustainability and justice. I think what the transitions framework tells us, and that's why it's very useful, is that you have to invest in institutions and that enable this transition. A typical transition, you ask experienced farmers, they'll say it might take 5 years to 8 years. Any system, whether you want to move from electric, from diesel to electric operated vehicles will also take time, and so on. So factoring this has been worked out quite a bit in the transitions framework. And I think it does make sense to sometimes use the niche regime and landscape. We've criticized it because of the linearity it assumes. So changes in niche need not necessarily translate to regime and landscape because of power relations existing here. But that's a different story. But one could use that framework. There are other frameworks as well. So India's own contribution to agroecology and sustainability transition is something which we hope to demonstrate. What I'd like to end is we are hoping that IIT Bombay will be in a position to take this agenda forward and maybe work towards a next conference where there is enough interest in establishing a space where a regional association for sustainability transitions can be taken up. It doesn't have to be restricted to agriculture. That was my bias, so to speak, because of the work I've been working on. But it could be on biomass, it could be on energy, it could be on any other space. But I think there is a lot of opportunity for Indian researchers and many young researchers here to increase both our presence and participation and hopefully contribution to sustainability transition. Huh? So hope some of you will, use this opportunity to be part of. I think this year it's almost over. Lisbon is the place where the workshop is happening in June. But if you plan ahead, you should be in a position to submit your papers and participate in IST 2017 or 2217. So thank you very much, and happy to take any questions, comments, or observations you need.
Sir, what is the meaning of emancipation in this case, making agroecology emancipatory? So, my understanding is free from legal, social, or any kind of boundaries. Is that the meaning
Yeah.
of?
So in the specific context, it was actually talking about the emancipation was more from emancipating yourself from the capitalist system of agriculture that existed in Latin America. So the peasant getting emancipated from a structure that binds herself or himself into a particular way of working with the market. And this is more acute in the case of Latin America. So the emancipatory framework comes partly from Latin America. There are movements like the La Viva Campesino, and that actually became a, an interesting part of agroecology. So, so it's in that sense that agroecology is not just about production; it should also work towards the process of creating social justice. It should change the relations in the community or between peasants in the market, etc.
So, on a local level, if there are two farmers, one farmer decides to grow for commercial crops like sugarcane, and the other farmer is not going for that level of crops. And if this particular sugarcane is absorbing a lot of groundwater, this person is facing an injustice because he's adjacent to his farm.
Absolutely.
So, would this agroecology
So
and
that's the
emancipation?
challenge that many farmers do face. A few weeks back, I visited a very interesting farm done by, an old friend. I was visiting a farm after 13 years. She's a PhD from IIT Delhi. She decided to go and settle down in this place in Karnataka called Hubbi. Has taken some land there, and it's amazing to see. So they have solar power, but not for the motor. The solar power is only to charge their batteries and cell phones, etc. She doesn't use WhatsApp, and the amount of transformation that occurs in the 2 acres of land just with the water that is hand, drawn is phenomenal. And in the same land, if you do proper mulching, you can see what's happening. Now the challenge essentially is she's growing trees because agroecology means a combination of agriculture and forestry. These trees have been grown with a lot of care and affection over a period of time. The neighbor says that your shade is now falling on my field and affecting things. The neighbor decides to run a trench, cutting many of the roots so that he or she is able to take up some of these activities. Groundwater, obviously, they can't use more because even if they have a solar powered thing, Aracanut is growing in that region, intensive sugarcane, similar case, a lot of water intensity, etc. But over a period of time, these two lands will appear different in terms of the soil content, soil organic carbon, etc. But it's very difficult to convince your neighboring farmer. In this case, she managed to convince a local villager. And it's a very, in some sense, a sad story that this person took it up very enthusiastically, started creating an agroforestry thing in this place. His brother his wife was so upset with what he had done, and she actually divorced him. And now what is happening now is that they have started working with young children and giving children this idea. So children now in a pond are putting up posters saying, "Don't bring your, your JCB to excavate things because this is important." And so this is very difficult at a farm level if it is not done by 5, 10, 20 farmers together. And therefore institutions are necessary to bring farmers together so that this experimentation is done collectively. If I'm spraying a lot of pesticides in my farm, you can easily, all the pests can go to a healthy organic farm and start affecting them. So,
When I check the definition of emancipation, it states that the fact or process of being set free from legal, social, or political restrictions. So in this case, we have to assign restriction, right? If a restriction is not
ideally, so
assigned,
that has to do with government. So can you set up rules that will ensure that others also follow the same idea? So let me give you an example. I visited Jodhpur sometime in December, and I was fascinated to see the value that people there have for water, which we take for granted here. It's a very dry place, and they've, deepened a particular place. The community imposes significant fines on people who bring their, who try and clean their vehicles in the pond or try and get a tractor to take things. This water is meant only for drinking, it's not even used for irrigation. So, how do communities create these institutions, which are the legal parts, that will lead to this? So, the legal part comes out in terms of governance. But in the case of what you had just quoted in definitions, it's much more to do with the political and social side.
so emancipation is very, I mean, we have to catch a midpoint. We need restrictions as well as we need a certain level of freedom as well. It's not complete freedom.
So, also in the sense that if I'm a Dalit farmer, will agroecology help me move away from the caste restrictions that were there in the natural, in another kind of farmer setting? So is it emancipatory? That's the question that Caroline was posing. And she didn't find in the small sample that she saw, she didn't find enough people from the lower castes actually taken to agroecology. But then that's a larger structural issue.
Thank you, sir. So I would like to ask, like you showed, like how you discussed 5 papers. So what were the limitations while writing those and to your research basically? I guess somewhat was answered before.
Yeah, what are the limitations? You have to ask the 5 authors who wrote it. So,
So you were one of the
yeah, so the limitations in some sense, or I'll probably say the challenges on getting these papers out. And I think, this process is an interesting process because sometimes people in the field have enormous amount of knowledge, which as researchers might take us a lot of time. But they don't necessarily write it up. And, the academic language and all of that, people can give up at different points. So our job was to persuade, cajole, etc. by saying, okay, I will do this, and so on. And finally, it has to go through a peer review process. So many may not be involved in academic writing, so that's one of the challenges that we face. But having invested in that time, the richness of content that you're able to get from the 2 papers I was associated with, the one from Will Sabarmati, which we had 2 advisors from abroad as well. I think that kind of information is existing only with them. It's not in part of any academic journal. And I think it's our responsibility as academics to try and get this out so that this can be part of the discussion. Otherwise, there is this narrative which, in some sense, this is questioning. Agroecology has been very human friendly. So here you have a comprehension. Don't take it for granted. It's always going to be human friendly. There are other kinds of dynamics, and therefore this concept of intersectionality, you have to look at gender along with caste and other kinds of things in a local area. So those are some of the challenges that we face. I think the biggest challenge is is something that we are concerned with. How do you get academics to work with civil society organizations or networks? Uh, that's what Shiva and Om were doing with their work that they're trying out. And I think there's some interesting insights now. I think one of the leads was to see, can we use some of these pioneering farmers to actually understand their practice better? Uh, and will that help us set up benchmark? Because anything today can be called organic, and certifying something as organic is a very expensive process. So how do we actually work out some of these? So all these elements are areas for significant amount of research. And one thing that we might suggest through this work is that it, it's a bit of a surprise, but not an accident, that there was not a single agriculture university that actually participated in this conference. Maybe we didn't try enough, because IITs and all are very different, and agriculture university, they have their own logic of how things happen. But how do we actually get them to engage with these questions? How do we work with them? How do we get scientists to work with farmers and their kinds of knowledge? I think these are big challenges and questions. And we have not had an event where these papers have talked to each other. So maybe we can consider that. We've been trying to see if that's a possibility. When we get all these 5 papers and authors together and speak about it.
Thank you, Professor. Beautiful lecture. So, in this conversation last, what I got feeling is, and you touched this topic once also, like in a field where if the farmer has a certain amount of land, where he will do this kind of experiment, it's a big problem. So, these kind of things scientists they do with spatial statistics. Yeah, there are some models and the statistics begin from there only features. So is there any framework that can be made for that will be also spatially very variable because this land, they will be different. So is there any framework that will be and special and this thing now quantifying the change that one farmer did this, but how it will be different. So in this aspect, this subject of remote sensing, the drone technology, this how you are seeing this kind of topics, technology intervention.
Yeah, I think the challenge is the broader challenge is how do you get alternate metrics? If you say yield alone is not a good enough metric, how do we bring alternate metrics? So this thing might say, how has biodiversity increased in my field? So that would require a different kind of assessment. Are more birds coming to my field as opposed to someone else? Now, in this farm I was talking to you about, they had a small pup, a leopard came and took it away. So, and they have, a huge amount of biodiversity, but sometimes this is not captured. But who will do it? The farmer is doing enough. So researchers will actually have to work this out separately. So one is to say, for example, let's take the case of soil organic carbon. So here's an interesting case where Yatish, the farmer I was talking to you about, who experimented in his field, he then went and did an assessment of soil organic carbon over a period. So most soil organic carbon tests are, while we have soil health cards, it's a good thing to go and actually see in places how these soil health cards are being done. Because the target for doing soil health cards is so much that actually they're manufacturing results. Everyone's farm has the same kind of soil health. Huh? So this scientific data is still lacking. Scientific data is lacking even in understanding natural farming. So it is based on with natural farming is associated with tradition. We've had great traditions in the past. The cow is a great animal, etc., and its urine is the best in the world, and so on. But has enough studies been done on what's the difference between cow urine and buffalo urine? And is it to do with what the cow is, or is it also to do with what the cow eats? If the cow is roaming around eating plastics and other things, it may also not give the same kind of effect. This kind of research, which requires a scientific bent of mind, is not being pursued as much. And I think much more possibility does exist to do this. I'm not so sure whether a drone will actually be able to tell you the difference. The drone might tell you the difference in color between two fields, and that visual is strong enough in some cases. So if you do take an SRI field and a non-SRI field, a drone picture will be able to tell you that an SRI field is more greener in terms of the rice, this thing than others. But beyond that, what's happening below the ground, and a lot of agroecology is actually a root revolution. The presence of microorganisms, etc. That's very difficult to find from, I don't know, and our remote sensing, will you be able to get it or not, is a different question altogether. Drones, I'm not so sure.
Sorry, I have to go now.
Do you have any one last word about your own paper that I didn't touch you want to share?
We said the debate, it's
Give another talk.
yes. Now maybe see the framing. We said the altering the natural farming narrative. That is like in the earlier talk, sometime in the Sitara seminar, I have mentioned. Whenever organic farming, you say, oh, it doesn't work. What it means in the paper, apart from subsidy, the key insight is that we are not applying enough organic manure. Partly maybe because it's costly, non-availability and other things. But what we then show is that the places where you apply enough manure, then the yields are substantially higher. So part of the so-called perception about organic farming is related to how much input that's going in, rather than a binary, or Sri Lanka organic farming didn't work. So overnight, nobody is ready. They didn't have enough organic fertilizer to work. So that's the important takeaway from paper farming. But I'll be happy to talk more anytime with individually and collectively. Sorry, I have to go now.
Thanks.
So my question is about the examples which you gave, maybe of Bhaitaka farm in Anand or Sabi. So I look at all of these initiatives as rich people's business, where they have substantial time, patience to look for the success of all these maybe organic farming and all. So do you have any stories of normal farmers, maybe very much dependent on agricultural produce, switching to all these kind of practices?
Yeah, so one example I gave is that of Yatish, who's converted his farm from. Yeah, so I think these are cycles. You need pioneers like what Bhaskar Survey has done or what Sarvadaman Patel is doing. So if I have to do the kind of science that is involved in what Sarvadaman Patel has done is phenomenal. He understands the soil in a different manner. If I had to conduct an experiment, I would rate his experiment as good or even much better than what a farm in Anand Agriculture University is doing. If Anand Agriculture University, we don't ask this question, treat Anand Agriculture University or any agriculture university as a landlord. How much land do they have typically? Which IIT has the maximum land? Why? Because they have agriculture. Yeah, so some things require that kind of investment. The point essentially is the purpose is first they understand such details of science and the nuances which requires them to do experiments over several times. So he has chosen, given his ability and capability, he's chosen to get 20, 30, 40 acres of land. But if you are able to draw principles from it to get farmers to experiment in their own land, and I think that's now happening in some parts of India. Much of the spread of organic farming in eastern India, central India, etc., are not well-resourced farmers. I was very surprised in Uttar Pradesh, in Mirzapur, to meet a farmer who came back from the Gulf and no NGO was supporting him. And we were studying rural entrepreneurs at that time. And he actually started learning about multi-layer farming from YouTube. And I think there's someone in Sagar district called Chaurasia, Akash Chaurasia. So he saw his videos and then started. So, such things are also happening. these are important as pilgrimage spaces. So you go and see and visit and understand how this has happened. But it's not necessary that I can replicate that in my own farm. I have to make my own experiments, my own innovations, and then also treat it as a transition. It's not going to happen in 1 year, 2 years. The biggest challenge today is if it takes 3 years for a farm to move in that direction, who is going to bear the costs of that particular time? Therefore, institutions do matter. In Andhra Pradesh, the spread has happened because of this community resource persons available to you whenever there is a problem. They can go and tell you in a farmer field school, ye karo, ye mat karo, etc. Gujarat is sharing, we have the same numbers and they have done no investment in these institutions at all. What they are saying in terms of numbers, I have given 900 rupees subsidy if I have a desi cow. And if I have given a desi cow, that means they're doing organic and natural farm. Our field level insight says it doesn't translate that way. The farmer is using that 900 rupees for other work. He's not making Jivamrit and other kinds of things because he or she is not being trained sufficiently. So this is going to be a process.
So you talk about institutionalizing all these things, like, and we do have previous examples of these kind of schemes, maybe with other contexts, maybe with water recharges and these things going in other directions, maybe with some other. So what threats do you think if you over institutionalize these kind of?
So institutionalized, I mean, there's a difference between institutions and institutionalization. No. So a farmer field school is an institution. It's an institution of an agricultural extension system that is different from the one that we had in Green Revolution. What happens in Green Revolution? It is dependent on the seed. I have a miracle seed. I will take it to a farmer who is well endowed, who has enough water, pesticides, etc. I will demonstrate that this works well, and then I don't need to do it in multiple places because then I will sell the seed and it will be taken up elsewhere. Agroecology is knowledge intensive. At every stage, I need certain kinds of input. So, a farmer field school is a mechanism of trying to create experts who are not coming from the agriculture department, but farmers themselves who are able to get this knowledge, who are trained well. So, that is an institution. So, is there enough investment in those institutions? Once there are significant number of institutions, then you can talk about institutionalization. That this should happen in this scale, etc. It's just a distinction between the two. We are not investing enough in institutions.
Questions?
Sir, if I make or produce organic tomatoes or agroecological tomatoes, is there any certification body in place that at least proximally certifies okay, this to make it a distinct? If I
Okay.
have to market it.
Yeah, so there are 2, 3 kinds of certification. So one is, suppose I want to export my tomato that you are making. I cannot export it and call it organic unless it is the what is known as a third-party certification. Indocert and many such organizations will have to come. Will have to do studies to see what is known as internal control systems are in place for a while. Your land has remained like this without any residues for a long period of time, etc. So that's what is known as a third-party certification. There is again an institutional innovation in India that has come out, which is known as the participatory guarantee system. So a participatory guarantee system. Suppose I do not want to sell my produce to Germany. So the cost of certification is so high if I have to sell it. So that gets added to the consumer's cost as well, right? So, but suppose I have a PGS certificate, what it says is it's basically a system to create a trust between the producer and the consumer. So the institutions like the Timbuktu Collective, the Center for Sustainable Agriculture, they invest in collecting this data locally. I can be part of such a system for 10, 20, 50 farmers in my region. And you check whether this is being practiced over a period of time, and then the organization certifies that this is possible. Today, the government of India is looking at another certification for natural farming. It still has not come in place. Himachal Pradesh has a new certification system. You may have different ways by which organic is being sold. And many of the organic that you buy in the market is not, even if you buy from Big Basket, you can't really be sure that what you're getting is organic or not.
PTA is under government of
PTS is government, under government. So APIDA is the organization that helps in the certification.
and there is no ISO standard for system.
They have their own standards, so it has come under a bit of flack as well because some certification. A good example is what happens in Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh today has the largest area under organic farming, but there's significant fraud in the way farms have been. So some farmers don't know that their land has been declared organic. So yeah, so these things do happen, and I think they were pulled up by international agencies. Amul is getting into a big way in certification. So Amul has also started its own brand of Amul Organic.
Just wanted to give big thanks to Professor Shambhu Prasad for this engaging lecture. I know can be few more questions because there are a significant number of MTech and PhD students working in both area of agriculture as well as sustainability and transition. So I would just like to say Professor Shambhu Prasad has kindly accepted to be a visiting professor in Sitara. He has started visiting us at least now last 2 months. He has been making a 2-day visit here and hope his train continues at least till June while he's slightly more free from his IRMA responsibilities. So I would request all of you to avail this opportunity while he is here. So tomorrow till afternoon, I think he's there. I mean, he has a class. It is 6:30. Students will see him in the class also tomorrow. But morning, if there are any slots or evening, so please feel free to approach him or set up a time during his next visit. So that is also possible. So I request all of you to avail this opportunity that we have here at our doorstep. Thanks for encouraging students to look up for the next conference. This time is missed opportunity, but that can be also a possibility that students can think about writing up their work and submitting to these conferences. So, as a token of our appreciation, I would like to give this. This has come from
Thank you so much. Yeah, feel free to email me. I can maybe give you my email ID or I don't know.